Welcome back to The Doctor Will See You Now. Oh, the twists and turns that happens in the world of crime fiction, and the people whose paths cross the Doctor's, and you just open a wondrous box of literary delight. That's the case today. For those of you who know me well, I have had the good fortune to be working at Stirling University for a while. And in that time, I became aware of a colleague in creative writing who has penned this beautiful book. It gives me immense pleasure to welcome Dr. Liam Bell into the consultation room. Liam, how are you today?
I'm very well, thank you, Jackie. Thanks for having me. Very welcome. Very happy to be here in the consultation room.
It's an absolute joy. I have this massive desire to find new works, authors that I might not have had the chance to meet before. And who knew that just down the corridor there was somebody that I needed to get to know. You are senior lecturer in creative writing at the university, and if I might just start by talking about your personal journey as a writer, and to what extent writing crime and mystery has always been what you wanted to do, or has your path to the publication of Man at Sea, how has that been?
Yeah, long and winding, with all the usual pitfalls. No, I think so this is my third book, first book with Fly in the Wall Press, but third book overall. And I think my first book you could probably have called a crime novel, largely, in the same kind of vein. It's historical fiction set in the Troubles during Northern Ireland, called So It Is, but had a really strong crime kind of element to it. Second book was definitely not crime, called The Busker, and then this one I think started as much more kind of conventional historical fiction, if you like, if there is such a thing, and then slowly became apparent that actually the kind of drive of it, if you like, the narrative push of it was a thriller plot about what had happened in the war. So I really feel like I have always kind of straddled quite a lot of different genres, but I'm always very happy to be described as a crime or thriller writer, because I personally love crime and thriller, and I don't get on very well with books that have no plot, or no momentum.
An element of that within it. I wondered if I could ask you, how do your students respond to the fact that you're not just someone who is there to look at the theory of creativity and creative writing, but that you can show them and these are the books that I've written? How do they respond to that?
Yeah, good question. I think it's really important that they see that, and I think one of the first things that we say, certainly at master's level, to them is that we're all practicing writers, practicing in every sense of the word, and that we kind of are going through the same pain that they are. Maybe that's not the best way to frame it, but yeah, we're going through that same struggle, and that we're not talking to them in the abstract, that it is something that we're having to work through. And certainly the first thing I did when I was a student, both at undergraduate and master's level, was go and look out my tutor's books, and obviously give them a read. And I think it's really important that they see that it's practice rather than preach, or practice as well as preach.
I very, very much appreciated what you said about that sense of, you as the people leading them in their development, that we understand. We know what it feels like when the words just can't be found, or when the plot twist won't twist in the way that you want it, and it must be a great encouragement to them to think, yeah, they get me, and they know what this feels like.
Yeah, for that same reason, I'm always a big advocate for talking to them about rejection as well, which is obviously a slightly more kind of vulnerable topic, but I think it's really important for them to know that isn't just something that writers starting out deal with, that actually every step along the way you're dealing with it. So as much as possible, and without scaring them, I try to share rejection story as well.
Yeah, I wonder, talking with authors, and I wonder, is it a little bit, like in the world of romance, that not everybody's going to be right for you.
Yeah.
And in a sense, often what seems like, oh, my book's not going to get taken, it actually might be quite fortuitous, because when it is taken, it is with the right publisher, it is the right time. But I think as an author, especially an author, if you're starting out, it's hard not to be discouraged.
Yeah, totally. And you obviously don't have that concrete that it will get taken on at some stage. But no, definitely, I think that 100% pertains to Man at Sea, actually, because I first had what I consider to be a finished first draft of it back in 2017. So what's that? 5 years ago.
5 years, yeah.
And I mean, hugely different to the final version now. But I started sending that out to authors and publishers, and I mean, obviously at the time I was very sad that it didn't get picked up, but actually looking back, I can see that it wasn't yet the book that I wanted it to be. And obviously, hopefully now it is. So yeah,
brilliant. We'll get into the book itself, the nitty-gritty of it, but it was the first book that I've ever been aware of the publisher, Fly on the Wall Press, and people who watch know that I'm always in favor of shouting out about publishers, especially indie or smaller publishers. So Liam, who are they and what do they do?
So Fly on the Wall Press are a small press, as you say, based in Greater Manchester, and it's a very small team led by Isabel Kenyon, who was my editor here, and this is their first novel. So before that, they were publishing poetry and short fiction, both like magazines and anthologies, but also standalone collections. Really nice little kind of. I'd hesitate to call them pamphlets because they're, but pamphlet length collections, and so I actually submitted Man at Sea to them as a novella. So they had a novella call out. So it was I had two versions of it. I had a novel version and a novella version, and I was kind of wavering about which one I liked better. And I sent them the novella version because that was what they were advertising for, Fly on the Wall. And then they got back in contact with me and said, well, actually, we're starting to make this move into novels. So what would you feel about like expanding it a little bit? And I was like, well, actually,
you should say that.
No problem at all. So that was really fortuitous and serendipitous, and they've been great. I do so my first two books were with Myriad Editions, and I would have to say I've been massively lucky with the publishers I've worked with. Small presses, both of them, but both of them hugely enthusiastic and hugely supportive about what I was trying to do. Never a kind of, oh, well, actually, that's not, that's maybe not the most commercial choice, or maybe that doesn't fit with the zeitgeist, or what. It always been, let's push this as far as we can take it, and it's been a joy.
I love the two sides of the story, though, that for you it's the publication of the book, and for them it's the next stage in what they're doing as publishers. So yeah. Lovely so milestone there.
Totally a huge milestone. Very, very chuffed for Isabel as well that she's got a novel out there, and they're now open for their novel submission window for next year as well. So no, I think very much the next step, and hopefully they grow and grow and grow.
Thank you. Now, so to the book. I'd like to know how long was the idea germinating within before you put fingers to keyboards, or however you start, what was that time frame before the story started to develop?
Yeah, a very pertinent question, because actually I probably started thinking about this book in 2014.
Mm.
So it's been about 8 years. We have had 2 kids in that period, so that's maybe
Yeah.
that's an explanation. But no, I think the first ideas were in 2014, and it was a fascination with Malta and the political history of Malta. So I started just reading about Malta and politically, culturally, what kind of formed that country. And then as I was doing that, as all writers do, I started to look for the narratives within it. And actually what ended up being the prologue was the first thing that came to mind, which was during the war, this young boy, Joe, getting a telegram and not knowing what it was about.
Yeah.
And then, slowly started developing from that, but it was a long germination process.
Malta, then. Your interest in Malta, where did that begin?
Yeah, good question. So it originated actually back in sorry, there's an oyster catcher outside the window.
Which is wonderful. We love it. Yeah.
could be worse as a heckle, couldn't it? Yeah, the interest began, like I say, back in 2014, and it was actually after the Scottish independence referendum, casting about for another referendum story for parallels, essentially.
Yes.
And I wasn't looking for an exact parallel, and I wasn't looking necessarily for a novel. I was just looking for context, and it could have ended up being a Facebook post rather than a novel. I'm glad it was a novel rather than a Facebook post. But I started to research that because I was interested in the referendums, and there's 2 referendums in the period of the book. So in 1956, Malta has an integration referendum, which was to become part of the UK. So in all the wrangling over Boris Johnson, we could have had Maltese MPs saying yay or nay. And then 8 years later, 1964, they have a vote for independence and go their own way. So this massive swing. And so that was of real interest. But then I found out that my mum had lived on Malta when she was a toddler.
Wow.
With my gran and granddad, and I had my grand's diaries from that period. So that became the emotional connection, and then I was hooked.
This is really interesting, Liam. The person that I interviewed before you in the series, we were talking about stories, and I have this weird idea that the stories are there and they're just waiting for the conduit to be told.
Yeah.
So you begin, and presumably your interest in Malta began before you found out that your mum was there as a little girl.
Yep.
And then your grandson. So it's almost like this box opens up and says, Liam, here's all these things that you might need
totally
in order to progress your story. And I've got goosebumps, which is these things happen.
It's lovely when those things do fall into place, and that is for me what escalates it. I say escalates it, but what makes it, a novel idea rather than a short story or a Facebook post. That suddenly you've got all these different elements folding into, and the emotional, definitely.
Get me, because you mentioned about the moment when the seed started to germinate. So, thankfully before the COVID moments, were you able to go and did you go spend time in Malta?
Yes, very much so. I did three research trips, 2 of them on my own, and 1 of them with my family. So my wife and my 3-year-old daughter at the time, my first daughter. And it was really good to go with them, actually, because it showed me a different side of Malta. And then one of the trips, each time I stayed for maybe about a week, and went around museums and talking to people and all those types of things. But one of the trips, middle trip, I did by train. So when, because in the book, the characters in the 60s travel back to Malta by train overland. or overland as far as they can go overland. And I wanted to do that. I wanted to feel what that was like.
Wonderful. Yeah.
Which was great. And felt like during that COVID time, felt like such a kind of dream, you know, that idea of getting on these multiple sleeper trains on and off.
Yeah.
Crazy.
Yeah. And again, the movement, I think, you know, of people on a quest, people needing answers. You know, that one aspect of the book. Before we start to talk about that, though, I was intrigued. I loved it. The way you know, the format, and of course we've got 2 time frames, but as well as the 2 time frames, before each chapter, you give us a dictionary definition of a key word. And I always want to know what's going on inside an author's head as to the choices that they make, because I think when we find out, I always think it's so beautiful to find out why did you do what you did, and then when we read, it's like, oh, I see. So the dictionary definition.
Yeah.
Why?
So these, like you say, they come at the start of every chapter, but they are the dictionary that Joe, who's 11 at the start of the book, in the 40s, it's the dictionary that he's writing with his dad. And his dad is the titular man at sea, and he kind of drives the mystery, the quest, through the book, like you say. But I realized that he was, importantly for the plot, but he was an absence, right? That he isn't there.
Yes.
For the majority of the book. So I needed to find a way, or I felt I needed to find a way to show the connection between Joe and his dad, and show the kind of, that kind of deeper level of engagement between the two. So the way that I did that was that they had this dictionary that they were writing together with these kind of idiosyncratic definitions, and just put them at the top of every chapter, so that Victor, the father, became less of an absence, both for Joe, but also hopefully for the reader.
For the reader as well, yeah. It's a lovely thread through it. I felt the sea. And again, without giving too much of it, but that idea of the sea, because we also have the element of air in there as well.
Yep.
And you know, how do you use the sea in the novel?
Interesting question. Yeah, I think the sea is very, very much, I mean, this may feel like the most obvious thing to say in the world, but it's very much omnipresent in Malta. You know, you can't.
Yeah, you can't get away from.
You can't get away from the sea.
Yeah.
So it's very much a presence in Joe's life, and then obviously with his dad being away at sea, it's very much a presence in his life in that way as well. So yeah, it's constantly there in the 40s, and it's constantly the thing that's separating him from his dad, both physically but also in terms of his dad being drawn to the sea. So yeah, it kind of deepens, if you'll pardon the pun, it kind of deepens that sense of absence and disconnection, I think.
Yeah. But very, very beautifully done, I must say. If we can, well, no, first of all, I'd like to ask you about choosing to write from, you know, Joe's perspective in the 40s, and an 11-year-old boy. You know, there are different perspectives, so many that you could have taken, and so I wondered when Joe's voice capturing that, when did it come? Talk to us about Joe.
Yeah, so Joe was the first character I wrote. So like you say, there's 2 time frames, and the later time frames narrated by Stuart, who's an ex-RAF pilot. But Joe, is 11 years old, and he's Maltese, and he was definitely the first voice that came to me. And the thing that I was interested in with Joe was this gap between his experience of war and the kind of what's the word, kind of official experience of the war, particularly because the British very much treated Malta as a kind of fortress, right? A stopping point in the sea. So the people who were there were, and I mean, maybe it's too much to say they were an afterthought, but certainly the main function of Malta was in terms of its military aspects. So I was really interested in how his experience of that tallied, and that view of the war. And I guess in the back of my head somewhere was J.G. Ballard's Empire of the Sun, which does exactly that. And the other thing that was in the back of my head somewhere was, slightly oddly perhaps, was the Just William stories.
Wow. Okay.
Which I used to love, and I used to read them over and over and over again. And they were, well, some of them were set during the war or just after the war, and that slight gap between what's happening and what the narrator's understanding of it is just great, and also leads, going back to crime and thriller, leads to potential misunderstandings and those types of things that can be so useful for plot. Yeah. Thank you. Then we go to the 60s, and we have Beth and Stuart. And there is at the beginning of the book, there is such a tender moment at the start of the story. I really loved it. That sense of Stuart carries a torch, does he not? But I think it's okay for us to say that he's been injured, and it means so that his face it has been badly damaged in that. And this man's need to say, will she love me despite this? I thought that was so beautiful, Liam. Thank you.
A real tender moment in the idea of somebody who was has fought for their country, is that level of bravery, and yet there's that vulnerability there, and it doesn't matter what his colleagues, the nicknames that he give him or anything like that. It's what will she think? What will she think? It's very sweet. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. I really appreciate that, Jackie. Thank you. Yeah. So he's, like I say, he's an ex-RAF pilot who was badly burned after crash landing in Malta, and he's a member of this Guinea Pig Club, which is I'm actually going down to East Grinstead where they were based. How did they get the name? I wanted to ask you this, but now that you've mentioned them, because at first I was thinking, what is this? Why are these people? So tell us, reveal the Guinea Pig Club. So the Guinea Pig Club was a real life group of airmen who were badly burned. So what's called the airman's burns, where it's a big portion of your body. And they were operated on, all of them, by a guy called Sir Archibald Macindoe, down at the Queen Victoria Hospital in East Grinstead. And he was a big advocate for, he was a pioneering plastic surgeon, but he was also a big advocate for not treating them as invalids. So they got to wear their uniforms. He was this bit's a little bit more sketchy, but he was a big advocate for the nurses treating them, as kind of virile young men. So they would go out dancing with the nurses. Yeah. And when I say that's a bit more sketchy, just because he tended to hire nurses based on their looks and that kind of stuff, which isn't fantastic. Yeah. But that all fed into the novel in terms of Beth and Stuart. And so, yeah, they're a fascinating group, and the Guinea Pig Club, the name came from them themselves. So they set up this, what's essentially a drinking club, because they had these long recuperation periods between skin grafts, where they essentially had nothing to do other than change their dressings. So they drank, and they had a great sense of humor. So they would, the first treasurer at the club had such badly burned legs that he couldn't walk. So they named him treasurer so that he couldn't abscond with the funds. And they were full of that kind of, those kind of hijinks. So that does play into, the nicknames that he's given.
But then he's very much holding a torch, as you say, for his nurse in that period, who was the one who showed him tenderness and actually showed him, although Macindoe is the one who did the surgeries, it's the nurses who actually showed the longer
Do
care.
that care, that, yeah.
So yeah, the most important relationship in his life.
Now you mentioned that they set off on a train journey to return. Both of them with a different reason for returning. Can you, because I don't think it's giving too much away, but we won't talk about what happens there, but what drives each of these protagonists?
Yeah, like you say, I don't think that's a spoiler. I think fairly early on it's established. So Beth is going to try and find Joe, who is her stepson. So she's married Victor during the war. So she's going back 20 years later just to try and find Joe, fairly kind of simply. But Stuart has always suspected that his crash landing that caused these burns and all this pain has been a deliberate act of sabotage. So he's going back to Malta to try and find this member of ground crew that he remembers from the day that he crash landed, to find out what actually happens. And so that, for the final period of the book, that's very much the kind of reveal is what has happened there. Yeah,
and so bringing into the book the idea of going back, the past memory, choosing that 20 years, because again, the previous author that I spoke to, there was a 20-year period difference, albeit the 1980s and the 2000s. What do you think 20 years does? What does that allow as an author? And maybe what are the limitations in choosing 20 years?
Yeah, good question. Particularly the limitations part. I think so. 20 years was, part of it was that's the period. That's how long it took Malta to really undergo that transformation towards independence. So part of it's about Malta, but in terms of Stuart and Beth, that's the kind of length of time that it takes them, I would say, to work through the trauma of the war, essentially. In so much as Beth is still working on the wards up until the 60s, up until Macindoe dies in 1960 itself. And so very much still caught up in the kind of, what's the word, procedures of the war. Yeah. And for Stuart, he's trying to wrestle his kind of identity free of that, and find a way of I don't want to say living independently, because he does live independently, but finding a way to wrestle himself back to the version of himself that was present in the 40s. Yeah, and that idea of the truth. Yeah. And being able then, to lay certain ghosts to rest. Yeah. And actually, I would say that they need. Beth asks Stuart to come back to help find Joe, but actually, it turns out that they both need each other in order to lay those ghosts to rest. Right? They're actually not, either of them, strong enough to go and do that themselves. So they very much come as a duo. I suppose their dynamic. How did you find writing that? Was it a joy, or were there times when you really struggled, as these two went on their journey? How was it for you? I mostly enjoyed it. I think I actually ended up writing it as two halves. So I wrote all the 1940s and then all the 1960s, and then I started alternating it. And I think that made it a little bit easier, in so much as for Beth and Stuart in the 60s, it happens in quite a tight time frame, so it was easier to imagine them, and knowing that they were only in Malta for kind of a week, it would all unfurl. It would have to all unfurl, and they'd have to reach that kind of reckoning, if you like. So yeah, I mostly enjoyed it, and because I'd written the 1940s stuff first, I kind of knew where I was going with the 60s, plot wise, although obviously it required a lot of kind of honing and redrafting, as always, you know.
Yeah. And in the moments where you're there in the 60s and you've been doing that research into 60s, was there an aspect that really delighted you that you might not have known about life in either 60s Britain or 60s Malta? Was there something that just shone out as you were doing the research?
Oh, I love this question because it gives me a chance to go back again to my grand's diaries. So my grand's diaries weren't actually of Malta, weren't actually from the 60s. They were from kind of 56, 55, 56. And during the Suez Crisis. So the reason that they left Malta in the end was because of the Suez Crisis. But they're not like Dear Diary diaries. They're like day diaries. So a lot of it's just like cooked lunch, and Anne goes down for a nap, Anne being my mum, which is an odd moment of cognitive dissonance to think of her going down for a nap. But yeah, from those diaries, there were just a couple of really clear details in her voice. So the first one was her and a friend passing notes via the Iceman. So as the weather gets warmer, the Iceman coming round and then passing notes to each other. Just the idea of an Iceman just hadn't occurred to me. The fact that
so he had a bit like an ice cream cart, but this was an ice cart, and going around the island delivering people much needed ice. Was that the?
He'd give them a big chunk of ice to keep whatever they wanted cool, and they'd kind of put it, well, depends what they had, but they put it in their kind of cold storage, wherever that would be. And the detail that was linked to that was there's a little note in my grand's diary about the milk going sour, so that's how she knows that it's starting to, the weather's starting to turn to summer. So those little details absolutely jumped out at me and went straight in the book. And I also did a lot of reading. I mean, there's lots again of kind of authoritative accounts of just the Second World War, but also the Second World War in Malta. But I also found quite a lot of self-published war diaries, and thankfully all of them really had those same little moments where I was like, it's those little details that really bring it to life for me.
Yeah, and make it that personal story.
Totally.
That is written. You mentioned about your field trips to Malta and doing that research. Were people happy? Did you meet with people, and were they happy to talk with you?
Yeah. Yes, and by and large, I went. I have to admit, I can't quite shake the slightly academic approach to it. So I'm a bit of a kind of, I always kind of chastise myself because instead of going and talking to somebody, I quite often would read like 9 books. I wish I was a bit better about just going and asking questions, but in general, yeah, people were very approachable and very interested to talk about. And actually, the Guinea Pig Club, the honorary secretary of the Guinea Pig Club, a guy called Bob Marchant, spoke to me at length, which was really invaluable. And hopefully I'll see him at the weekend. And on the Maltese side, or in Malta, there was the Malta Aviation Museum, which was very useful. But I had a great chat with the guy in there, a guy called Victor. Chatted to him for literally hours, and he gave me a cup of tea, and we were getting on famously. And then right at the end, I said, pointing at a hurricane, which is the plane in the book, and I was like, so really interested to find out all about this. Can I just ask you one final question, which is, if you wanted to sabotage one of these, how would you go about it? And his face just fell. He was like, no.
No, you don't do that. Yeah,
you don't do that. Exactly. Our job is to keep them in the air. And I was like, yeah, but for me, for a novelist, I'd quite like to know. And he was just like, no. So he essentially wouldn't answer that. And I understand why not.
Yeah.
But it meant that for quite a long time, it was quite important for the plot that the plane was sabotaged. So I had to go through quite a few kind of aviation experts until I found one that
It
worked,
would
but also that I
finally
could
spill the
try.
beans. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. But I did eventually find a kind of tame aviation expert who very kindly walked me through it.
I'm aware of the time, and I know, I know you're busy and things to do, so I don't want to take up too much more. But
Not
I
at all.
wondered, there's questions that I love to ask authors, and one of them is this: I know you want us to enjoy your writing, which author wouldn't, but I wonder if there was a certain aspect of the book that you are keen that either remains with us or sets as a question, by the time we get to the end of the book. Is there something that really matters to you?
Yeah, that's a lovely question. I think a big part of the book for me, so taking us read all the political and, like you say, the plot driven wish for you to enjoy, the plot drive of it. I think the other big thing that was the driving force for me writing it was the fact that at the time of writing, my first daughter was just about to be born, had second daughter through the course of writing it as well. So for a large part of it, I was thinking about what it meant to be a father. And what, I guess, kind of more broadly than that, what it means to have connections that actually persist and bind and that are worth, I don't want to say fighting for, but yeah, worth cultivating and maintaining. So a big part of it, I think, is I want it to be a meditation about why we form those lasting relations and what they mean and how they drive us. And actually, if we're talking about, as the novel goes on to talk about, like revenge and those types of things, actually how deep those connections need to be to drive those forces. So yeah, a big part of it was that, and that came for me from being a father for the first time.
Thank you for sharing. I mean, again, intimate side to being an author. My last question to you is, so because I'm sure viewers and listeners, if they want to get a hold of a copy of Man at Sea, where can they do so?
So all the usual places is the answer. Fly in the Wall Press, flyinthewallpress.co.uk is kind of the direct route. It's also up on Waterstones. Also the website that dare not speak its name. All those usual forums.
And do you have a bookshop where you are in Stirling that you would recommend people to visit?
Oh, 100%. Very much in favour of that question. Yeah, last Friday we held the book launch at the Book Nook, which is just in the centre of Stirling, and it's run by two former students of
wonderful.
It's a lovely bookshop. Does great coffee and cake as well. Beautiful secondhand and new books, and they're lovely, and I hugely recommend them.
Fabulous. Thank you for those tips, Liam. It just remains for me to say all the very best with Man at Sea, and I look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you, Jackie. Much appreciated.
A pleasure. Bye for now.
Bye.
Bye.